Dear colleagues, dear friends, we are going to look at the investigation of Nazi crimes in the context of the 80th anniversary of Babyn Yar. Our discussant today is Professor Dieter Pohl, one of the world-renowned scholars of the Holocaust. I will remind the participants that Professor Pohl is teaches at the Alpine Adriatic University. He is a member of the Council for Military Burials and a member of the Austrian-Ukrainian Historians Commission. I welcome Professor Pohl, and our speakers today are Mikhailo Martynenko and Staria Cherkaiska. I think that the particular context in listening to these very specific cases and details of research, we always feel that, on the one hand, that we're talking about the motivation of the actors. We often hear about shock, but on the other hand, we hear about this very critical, rational analysis of the sources. And that's why we understand how important this meeting is today of young Ukrainian scholars, as well as experienced ones and international scholars who work on this subject for many decades, because the peculiarity of the chronology of the printed work on this topic, I sense the unique nature of Ukraine in this topic, because when I have a publication and when I hold a publication that contains the research of Dieter Pohl and Karl Berghoff and other researchers of the Shoah in Ukraine, so this English language book was pretty quickly translated and published in Ukrainian. However, at the same time, unlike other countries of the West, this year we're publishing the Black Book, which is a text that is classic. I apologize for this expression. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Mikhailo Martynenko, who will talk to us about the investigation of the Holocaust in Lviv by the Extraordinary State Commission in 1944. Mikhailo, the floor is yours. Hello, dear colleagues. I will just hold a small presentation. Let me put it on the screen. Mr. Martynenko represents UKU, the Ukrainian Catholic. Right, I'm a doctor, a PhD student at the Catholic University, and I'm writing a dissertation on Soviet memory politics on the Holocaust in Lviv. And the investigation by the Extraordinary State Commission is one of the earliest stages obviously, most of the speakers have already mentioned these documents of the Extraordinary State Commission. I think that it's very important to understand how this institution worked, what the results were of these investigations, and of course, certain challenges and drawbacks. The Extraordinary State Commission, first of all, it was, on the one hand, directly investigating mass crimes, but on the other hand, it was also the first institution to form the narrative of the Nazi occupation in Lviv. And it is exactly from these two viewpoints that I will attempt to present their work. So, a quick introduction. The All-Union Extraordinary State Commission for the Investigation of the Crimes of Nazi Occupation was formed on November the 2nd, 1942. In 1943, there was a statute formed and regulations regulating the structure and the function of these extraordinary state commissions, local extraordinary state commission. Formally, the Extraordinary State Commissions was characterized as an independent body that was supposed to unite the community, but essentially it was a coordinating body between different party and state bodies and the law enforcement agencies. It had a secretariat, 6 departments for investigation, and other auxiliary departments. It's important to note here that there was a certain, there was a bit of a shift, because out of the 6 departments, 4 of them were were involved in various kinds of calculations of economic damage, depending on forms of property. So damage to collective farms, to state institutions, etc. Only one department was directly involved with mass murder. So that's the first kind of problem of the work of this commission. The goals were such that after the Soviet army entered a particular locality, of course, the Extraordinary State Commission was supposed to find and summarize the places of, they had to exhumate the places of mass burials. Of course, most of them were Jews and prisoners of war. They had to interrogate the witnesses and and survivors. Where possible, they were supposed to also find documents pertaining to Nazi crimes. And after investigations, the committee was supposed to count the human losses, destruction, and economic losses. It also performed a propaganda function. This is a little, this is a photograph that shows Nikolai Burdenko, head of the special commission dedicated to the so-called investigation in Katyn, who had to essentially whitewash the Soviet regime and argue and accuse German officers. And this commission of Burdenko actually was part of the Extraordinary State Commission. So we have to understand that sometimes their role was very, very controversial. As far as Lviv is concerned, it makes sense to remind us of the chronology. On July 27th, the Wehrmacht leaves Lviv. In August 1944, the commission was formed, formally headed by the first secretary of the Lviv regional committee of the party. And they also had as members other members of the party nomenclature, but essentially the investigations began on September 7th, 1944, when the Lviv regional prosecutor's office formed an investigation group headed by Petro Krzyżanowski. This investigation group comprised about 15 professional investigators, and they were also granted. They were also joining them were also forensics experts, including from Moscow. Obviously, military of the Red Army participated in the exhumation, and the NKVD, and the commission's work was also described by correspondence, etc. So what specifically were the investigators doing? So in September, October 1944, the investigators visited all of the large mass burials in the territory of Lviv. These are primarily the Yanev concentration camp with the Kurtumova Hora ravine, where the mass shootings happened. They also visited the Lysynichi forest, which was also one of the places of mass shootings, and they also surveyed the Stalag 38 camp for the prisoners of war on the territory of the Lviv citadel. Although they didn't manage to survey the territory for a mass burial, because at this point there was already a field, a training field, a military training field for the bomb squad, disarming German mines. So the work at the commission was made more difficult by the fact that the locations of the crime were being changed in the very first months after the Germans' departure from Lviv. In this very same time, the commission questioned eyewitnesses, including survivors. This was done both by the committee and local branches of the NKVD. However, unfortunately, we don't have the entire basis of the protocols of the questioning of these witnesses, because most of the archives are either in Moscow or and some of them are in the Museum of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. In October, November 1944, based on the data gathered as part of this exhumation, the commission prepared a summary report, and then in December 1944, the commission was supposed to prepare a report for the press. However, this text was changed and censored many times. That I will discuss this a bit later. The main results of the investigation of the Extraordinary State Commission were as follows. On the one hand, the people who worked in the investigation group of the Attorney's Office managed to correctly recover the chronology of most of the anti-Jewish actions in the city, starting from the wave of pogroms and then the rounding up of Jews in the ghetto and several deportation actions in the Yanev concentration camp and eventually to Belzec, the Belzec death camp, where the Jews were killed were gassed. This chronology, the investigators managed to recreate this chronology. And in the documents of the Extraordinary State Commission, initially, you clearly saw the term full annihilation of the Jewish population. So this policy was directly articulated. The investigators were most precise in terms of counting the number of Jews incarcerated in the ghetto, about 136,000, but also as far as, but there were some problems with the numbers of specific victims in specific mass shooting places, mass shooting sites. Primarily the problem was that most of the remains of the annihilated Jews were destroyed by the participants of the Nazi occupation. And so the investigators didn't have any particular, they simply couldn't count the specific number of the remains. And so they had to rely on pretty doubtful, dubious figures of ashes per person, or else they tried to establish the number of victims based on the data provided by Jews, testimony provided by Jews, which again I think is quite doubtful, because the Jews who survived the Holocaust might have very clearly told them of the fate of their families or their near and dear or their close friends, but obviously couldn't provide a good estimate of how many Jews were killed specifically in Lviv or in a specific place of on a specific mass burial site. Commission had another serious problem in that they didn't have enough investigators. I mean, only 15. It was 15 people to investigate the murder of about 150,000 people in 3 years. It's not enough. It's a very low number. As for the investigation itself, the time frame was very, very limited. Officially, according to the regulations, the regional commissions were only given a month to investigate. Obviously, this is not enough, insufficient. Another problem was in the fact that was in the preparation of the press report of the Extraordinary Commission that was to be published in the Soviet publications. The text of the report that came out in December 1944 significantly diverged from the conclusions of the investigators themselves. Firstly, the text removed almost all of the mentions of the Jews. So essentially, we had a narrative of the history of the Holocaust without Jews. And that's when this euphemism of peaceful Soviet citizens began to take hold. The only place that was even remotely linked with the Jews was the Lviv ghetto, according to this text. All the others were marked as the place of detention and murder of peaceful Soviet citizens. Another serious problem consisted in the fact that during the formation of this, in writing of this press report, there was a separate mention of Katyn, or the Soviet version of this crime. Consequently, the Soviet propaganda wanted to find similarity in the killing methods, both in Lviv and in Katyn, which of course devalues this report or lowers the value of this report. A massive problem was also the fact that the number of victims was significantly increased, overblown. So the number of the concentration camp was mentioned as 200,000 people, which exceeded the number of the Jewish population, pre-war Jewish population in Lviv. So, as far as general conclusions are concerned, the General Commission performed very important exhumation work, and importantly, the committee also managed to question those Jews that survived the Holocaust before most of these Jews left Lviv for Poland, or then were repatriated into Israel, or moved further westward or to the States. The data of the Extraordinary State Commission became a basis for trials against people suspected of participation in mass killings. Even those censored and limited data that were published did cause a stir, a social feedback among societies. Several writers, among them, most importantly, Volodymyr Belyaev, over the next 40 years, he wrote a lot on Nazi occupation and the Holocaust. In Lviv, he wrote fiction and essays on this. I think this is very important. Even to this day, during the memorialization of places dedicated to the Holocaust in Lviv, we use the data of the State Commission is used, particularly with the number of victims. I'll show you several slides that confirm this later. But it's important to note that this commission was formed already with certain congenital problems. The body wasn't entirely independent from the political will, and for which reason the investigation wasn't entirely full-bodied and objective. But for the most part, this was it depended on the nature of the totalitarian state that the USSR was at the time. And finally, I would like to demonstrate some part of the memorials where that mentioned the number of victims from the data of the Extraordinary Commission. This is a memorial this is a memorial plaque, memorial stone that mentions 200,000 victims. This data, to this day, hasn't been contested or corrected or counted. Same thing, this is on the territory of the Stalag 328, where that says that 140,000 soldiers of various armies died here, although really the investigators in their internal documents wrote of 40,000. And so at some point, at some point the number 140,000 started featuring in these reports, which is still not contested. Thank you for your attention. I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you, Mikhaila, on this very important presentation. Many useful details, and there's a certain localization of the historical moment when any mention of the Jews is obliterated in the Soviet commemoration, and this shadow of the Soviet man, of the Soviet citizen, begins to haunt the descriptions. And we'll come back to this in the discussion, but I would like to ask everybody to keep their questions in mind, or write them into the chat. And then I ask the discussant and all of the other participants to return to this after our second presentation. We will now hear Ms. Daria Cherkaska, who will talk of the use of archaeological approaches to the study of the history of the Holocaust in Ukraine, challenges and prospects. Daria Cherkaska is works at the Center for Archaeology at the Staffordshire University. Daria, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this important event. I would like to present now a study based on my broader dissertational research dedicated to the use of archaeological approaches to the study of the Holocaust in Ukraine, problems and prospects. But before I start, I would like to warn that due to the peculiar nature of my research and the sources I use, I will use photographs, fairly graphic photographs with human remains. So content warnings. If you are sensitive to this or are not prepared to watch this, please be minded. Please be reminded. Please close your screen and not look. But in order to explain my research, I have to use these graphic depictions. So just heads up, content warning. Thank you. We heard you. We understand. Right. So the study of sites of genocides, including the Holocaust, are not a terra incognita for the 21st century. The forensics first arose in the States in the late 70s, forensic archaeology, and then developed in Europe, Britain, and Australia. Firstly, the police used forensics archaeology to help find the bodies of missing persons. Thus, one of the first cases where these methods were used was the search for the body of the 3-year-old Stephen Jennings in 1988. However, the roots of these methods go back to the early 19th century. The judicial methods and forensic methods of studying developed very strongly over the past 40 years. The forensics archaeology is broadly used in many countries of the world to investigate crimes. When we say forensic archaeology, we understand the use of archaeology and methods to resolve medical and legal and humanitarian questions. Considering the peculiarities of the Holocaust, the way and the sites of annihilation of people, the biggest category for the study of archaeological methods and techniques are the mass burials and killing sites that are often located next to each other. So in my presentation, I will focus on these, even though forensic archaeology is not limited to them. Unfortunately, there still isn't a single definition of a mass burial. There also isn't a consensus on the minimal number of burials. In my research, I refer to this definition of mass graves. It's a place of burial that contains often mixed remains of no less than 6 people with different configurations of the forms of the trench and hole, or separate burials and burial chambers separated into separate chambers. Now, it's important to note that prior to the Second World War, humanity did not face the need to study mass burials in the legal context, although the first attempts to study such burials were made after the First World War. But the concept of genocide was only introduced by Raphael Lemkin in November 1943, and it was only included in the international legal field in 1948. And so the study of burials can be seen as frontier of research for the late 1940s. Funnily enough, it was the Nazis that were one of the pioneers of this research. When they discovered the burials of the victims of Soviet repression in occupied territories, as you can see in the photographs on the screen, on your screen. This shows the process of exhumation and digging up burials in Lviv, but it should be noted that these earliest research are not part of investigation, and on the whole, it's not really correct to call them an exhumation, because an exhumation is only one of the parts of research, because the process of exhumation in criminology today is called the removal of human remains from burial site, that is done with the permission of a prosecutor or experts. At the same time, this process has to be clearly outlined in reports, clearly delineated and described in reports. And an example of more scholarly research is the later studies in Vinnytsia and in Katyn. In my report, in my presentation, I will not stop on the results of these investigations and why they were performed, but you can see that the presentations take pains to describe in great detail these investigations. Now, previous reporters already said that archaeological methods of investigation have been used by the Extraordinary State Commission. Here's, for instance, the investigation in Sokal. And for the moment, reports of this kind are also an important source, because they can be analyzed. The results of exhuming can be analyzed with using all of the achievements of modern archaeology and forensic archaeology. I will also put here the later research of Soviet archaeologists in the 60s and the 70s as a response to the wave of processes against German criminals, which we already mentioned in yesterday's discussion, because it was precisely the 60s and the 70s that became the peak of a new wave of trials over local collaborators. And one example of such a case is the case of Salavatov, trial of Salavatov in Crimea. However, in spite of these achievements, forensics archaeology is not seen as it's not considered a separate field in modern Ukraine, which is a problem, because from the point of view of the contemporary academic community, archaeology is only the study of things long past. So archaeology is the archaeology of things past. This obviously brings archaeology to ancient history and marginalizes places that have to do with the history of the 20th century. Although in spite of the fact that forensic archaeological approaches are not widespread in Ukraine yet, we do have some positive results. One such research, one early example of research is the archaeological investigation done by the team of Richard Wright in the early 90s in the town of Serniki. These investigations were performed as part of the in the trial of Ivan Polyakhovich against the community of nations. He was accused of mass murders of Jews in the village of Serniki in 42-43. However, in spite of the fact that archaeological research found mass burials, and the team, Professor Wright's team, made an estimate of the numbers of the burials and the size of the burial, the numbers of people buried and the size of the burial sites. It was impossible to find proof that it was specifically Ivan Polyakhovich who was to blame for the murder itself. I highly recommend this very interesting article by Peggy O'Donnell in one of the issues of Holocaust and Genocide Studies on this. Also, recently, there are many examples in Ukraine recently that had to do with the commemoration of sites of the Holocaust, and it was precisely in the territory of these locations that they use non-invasive research methods. Why non-invasive? I'll explain further on. An example of this is the work of for the Center of Archaeology of Staffordshire University as part of the Rohatyn Jewish Heritage Initiative in Ivano-Frankivsk region, and in several sites that have to do with the Holocaust in the Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr regions prior to the construction of the memorials as part of the German-Ukrainian project Protecting Memory project. The geophysical methods were also used during the investigation of the well-known headquarters of the Wehrmacht in Verwolf, in Rylif, in Vinnytsia region, in Brykhovichi, in Rylif, in Lviv region. Investigations done by Thatcher and Wright. Most of these investigations have to do with commemoration projects. However, the problem of using non-invasive methods is the fact that often, mostly they use data acquired in the course of archaeological research, and also data, maps and photography from aerial photography from wartime and pre-war time. The use of archives and oral history is not very widespread, but it is precisely the non-invasive methods that require a very clear interpretation and very detailed work with other sources to achieve more detailed results. Another example of the use of the archaeological approach is the use of metal detectors. This practice has been widely used several years ago by the team of Yahad in their research in their collection of eyewitness testimony of people who were witnesses or participated in the annihilation of the local Jewish population. And it was the use of metal detectors that was an attempt to confirm the words of the eyewitnesses, and the team used configurations of bullets or shells that might confirm the locations of execution or mass burial. As an example of this, we have in 2006 the study in Khvativ. However, in spite of the fact that the Yahadanun team are involved in extremely important work on eyewitness testimony, nevertheless, their approach to the use of metal detectors is quite controversial because, as we know, the territory of Ukraine became the arena for very serious fighting. Additionally, we have to remember that all of Ukraine has places that have to do not only with the Holocaust, but also with Soviet repression and also the work of the fight between various groups. And so the question of using metal detectors is quite controversial and can be used only as an auxiliary method, but we cannot rely, it's impossible to rely exclusively on metal detector data. Additionally, Yahademun used in 2006 the most widespread example of archaeological research. There were excavations in the city of Busk, in the town of Busk, where they studied locations of mass burial sites at the local Jewish cemetery. During these investigations, they found a mass burials, and also through locating personal belongings, personal effects, they preliminarily supported the presence and the date of these burials. Unfortunately, archaeological research is not always the best method for the study of places, of Holocaust sites. The problem is that archaeological research in and of themselves are a destructive research method. And it's important, an important component of this is to create a detailed report of the findings. However, as I've already mentioned, the lack of central database and the dispersion of this research and lack of control over this kind of research leads to very important information often being lost. Additionally,
Пошуки, пов'язані з дослідженням Голокосту та геноцидів, можуть бути дуже травматичними та чутливими.
Additionally, today, research into Holocaust and genocide can be extremely traumatic for the local population. A key challenge for modern-day academics is trying to strike a balance between academic principles and the search for their implementation that would not offend or sadden representatives of other communities or relatives. It's important to note also that site work that have to do with the Holocaust is also made more difficult by the fact that you have to take into account the opinions of the ancestors and also the locals, who are often forced to live next to this fairly traumatic heritage. Likewise, considering the peculiarities of the Ukrainian context, we should point out that it wasn't just the Jews who were victims of the Nazi occupation, but also members of other social and political groups. As a result, memory sites are often sites for commemorative competition, and they also create ethical dilemmas as to whether certain categories of victim deserve to be commemorated. For instance, the fighters of the OUN or UPA. Can they even be considered victims? Ought they to be considered victims? Because often what happens is that it's possible to find both victims and their murderous collaborators in the same burial. It's also difficult. Another difficulty is the difficulty of identifying specifically the remains, where there are more than one set of remains. Who these remains belong to. The main methods in the 20th century was the typological peculiarities, or recognition by the inquest by the relatives or near and dear. But this is unfortunately almost impossible with these remains that we have in these. Or the search for personal effects. But again, this is limited efficiency with when we have multiple victims, because the peculiarities of the decomposition of the human body, things can mix and a document that used to belong to one person can be found next to another person. However, 21st century science revolutionized DNA analysis, and so on the one hand, the identification of remains was made much easier, because once you have a DNA sample of a relative, that helps identify the remains with almost 100% accuracy. However, in order for such a method to work, you have to have a database of DNA of DNA samples, a database of DNA samples so that you might identify with reasonable precision whose remains you are dealing with. And here it's important to mention why specifically the burials of the Holocaust, why it's important to use non-destructive, non-invasive techniques, research techniques. Well, this has to do obviously with the fact that the majority of the victims who were buried there belonged to the Jewry. And so the study of such burials require our regard for the norms of the halakha, the Jewish religious law, which states that any violation of a place of rest, of Jewish rest, is categorically forbidden. It's desacralizing, the sacrilege. And so, considering that the victims were trying to destroy Jewish population both physically and spiritually, so to speak, it would be a mark of respect to hold to the religious halakhic norms. However, unfortunately, these norms are often ignored in contemporary Ukrainian research. Also, currently, we don't have in Ukraine an organization that would control these things from the point of view of maintaining religious norms, preserving religious norms, such as they have in, let's say, in Poland, where they have a special organization, Zapomniane, forgotten. They investigate Holocaust sites, but in their research, they very clearly try to preserve these norms, these religious dictates and halachic dictates. To conclude, would like to mention a very important aspect of work with the sites of the Holocaust that aren't sufficiently mentioned, unfortunately, because these sites are often found in the outskirts or hidden from the human eye, invisible to the human eye. So they are objects of plunder. You see an example of traces of a plundered grave in Berdichev, where you can see the remains of these wooden constructions show that this plunder was extensive. It didn't just happen in a day. It wasn't a one-off, one-day occurrence. There were human remains on the surface. Police were called, and unfortunately, because such sites, for instance, this particular burial in Berdichev had no landmark status from the state, wasn't in any way protected. Unfortunately, we couldn't. Unfortunately, it was impossible to resort to the norms of Ukrainian law that prohibit the plunder of archaeological objects or burial sites. But because human remains were found in this site, the police were called with forensic experts, and the presence of human remains allowed us to start criminal proceedings about grave desecration, plundering graves. However, this problem is not this is not the single case. Here's another instance, also in Berdichev, where you can see the remains of special paths used by plunderers, and every year the local Jewish community marks that there's more and more. There's an increasing number of these passages, and unfortunately, a positive example on one of the burials. This practice doesn't work on other in other graves with other graves. Here's another example. This is Slavuta, the town of Slavuta in Khmelnytsk region. Here, I should explain that the main sites that have to do with the history of the Holocaust in Slavuta do have landmark status from the local administration, and they are more or less under control, relatively. I'll talk in great detail about this a little later. However, this burial is a likely burial site that was marked in reports of the Extraordinary Commission. However, subsequently, because the site itself was not confirmed, it was not put on the real estate, on the landmark list, so it has no protected status. However, as you can see in these indentations and these holes, the fact that it's not officially supported on behalf of the Ukrainian state does not preclude the plunderers to search the so-called Jewish gold, or I actually don't know what they are looking for. And unfortunately, because this is precisely the site where a superficial visual survey did not provide any human remains, it was impossible to open criminal proceedings on this, or in some other way try and protect this site. The only possibility, the only opportunity for defending sites of this kind is to hold archaeological research, because it was precisely locating the specific site of burial is grounds for providing protected status. So I really hope that after quarantine we can return to this site, confirm the presence of a burial site, and offer protected status. This is another example in Slavuta. As I've already said, in spite of the fact that other burials do have a protected status, nevertheless, I think this is this very strange attitude by the local community, because here on the right-hand side, there's a huge memorial behind these trees that marks the site of the burial of the Jewish community of Slavuta, Jewish population of Slavuta. it is in reasonably good shape, but not 20 meters from this memorial, there was, if you can see, I don't know if you can see on these slopes, there was a path. A path was created by the local population for motorcycle races. And unfortunately, this site is, although it is commemorated and it is protected, but on the other hand, the lack of work with the local community leads to these very sad consequences. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Pani Daria. This was very important for us to hear this powerful argumentation for the use of archaeological approaches in our subject, in the study of our subject. And genuinely, I mean, even the concept of archaeology, as we know, has changing semantics. It broadens. There's a big number of numbers, of meanings. Like we can look back to Michel Foucault with his archaeology of knowledge, and some controversial aspects with metal detectors and other technical aspects are actually a very important topic for discussion. Now, I would like to point out that both presentations draw our attention to the relationship between the micro level and the macro level, which were already stressed by Professor Dieter Pohl, and it is precisely when we try to articulate this connection, this relationship between the micro level and a particular settlement, and then national level, and then the level of what was happening continent-wide during the Holocaust. This gives us the opportunity to comment very specific information. For instance, information such as what Yahadanunu is working on. For those who are watching us, I would like to remind you that the president of this structure, of this body, is Father Patrick Dubois, was in Ukraine this year as well, and he came back also. He's been to Ukraine many times, and he came back because of the presentation of his book, Holocaust by Bullets. This book is in open access on the website of Duhi Litera Institute for Judaica. I would like to give the floor to our discussants now, so that we can hear Professor Dieter Pohl's opinion and comments on both presentations. Professor Pohl, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the two presenters for their really enlightening papers. And I think these were not only on what the title of the panel says, Investigation of Nazi Crimes. This is memory history of memory culture, history of memory politics. And though we have a lot of studies in these fields, or comparatively well researched, many fields remain unexplored, especially concerning the very immediate post-occupation period from 44 to about 47 to 48, but also in the second paper on material heritage of the mass murder. I want to start the other way around with Daria Cherkaska's paper, who presented a rather unknown approach to Holocaust history on a local level, forensic archaeology, especially of mass graves. You could think of buildings, walls, and so on in this respect. The scientific approach is fairly new. I would say around 3 decades. For example, the Belzec excavations were started at the beginning of the 1990s, which took a little bit different approach. Maybe I add that mass graves always, or for a long time in history, have been a point of specific, I would say, also cultural interest. Just think of the battlefields of the wars in, for example, World War I. After World War I, there was probably the biggest reburial of soldiers or fallen soldiers ever, because all nations wanted to have their soldiers in their cemeteries and not collected over the battlefield. Thus, I think these excavations always have to be seen in context with the local environment, and they are also cultural events in a certain sense, especially if you have a reburial, not so much the scientific forensic archaeology. But what we have in first place, and you mentioned the German case, the German avant-garde in forensic archaeology, which is a bizarre thing, is the political use of this forensic archaeology. And most famous, like the two cases you mentioned, Katyn and Vinica. But you might know that right after the Katyn campaign, the Romanian authorities in Transnistria also found a mass grave, but unfortunately, and claimed it was a grave of NKVD victims. But unfortunately, these were the victims of their own crimes. And there's a nice correspondence about that the Germans blamed the Romanians, who are so stupid, to unearth their own graves. But this is a highly a hot topic in 43, because there is now, let's say, the counter narratives. The Germans claim that the Soviets have mass graves, and the Soviets, you shouldn't forget, are unearthing in the North Caucasus at the same time as the Germans do it. One thing which always interested me, probably Karel knows a little bit more about that the Germans were aware of lots of NKVD mass graves already in 1941 beyond the prisons, but they didn't use them in 1941, 1942, which is a strange thing, because after the Lviv, the prison propaganda campaign, it would have been logical to follow up on this. For example, the Germans knew about Babyn Yar very early in September 1941. I think one of the most important parts of this story are the exhumations by the Extraordinary State Commission, which were more or less professional, undertaken in a professional way during that time. Of course, they didn't know that the modern methods of exhuming and analyzing mass graves. But it's important to see that these were systematic exhumations on mass crimes. And this is the next case is only during the 1990s in Yugoslavia, following both the civil wars on the one side and, for example, in Slovenia and Croatia, this unearthing is still going on concerning the post-war crimes of the partisans who killed the collaborators. There are several hundred mass graves in Slovenia and Croatia. But the CGK material is very important because it located the mass graves, and it then tried to estimate the number of corpses. I will come back to that in a minute. And though these Soviet statistics are somewhat exaggerated, they are still, the information is very important. Your focus was, of course, on the modern excavations and modern forensic archaeology, and now it's switching to this non-invasive methods due to the requirement of the halakha. The important thing, I think, for the historian is to put that in context. On the one side, you need these eyewitnesses to locate them. On the other side, you need the eyewitnesses to put together a story about the mass grave, a story about the mass murder, which happened in 41, 42, 43. I think these results significantly add to our knowledge of the mass murder on a local level. They determine the exact location and the way to the mass murder from the ghetto to the execution site, and the actual cause of the execution. For example, the forensic archaeologists often can determine whether these people actually were killed by bullets or were suffocated, which apply to many of them. For example, small children often were thrown into the pits without being shot. And finally, to a certain extent, it's possible to identify victims if they have personal documents, if they're not in decay right now. So this is one important piece for the whole history of the Holocaust on a local level. On the other hand, I think it's very important to investigate into mass graves of other victims of Nazi crimes, especially the Soviet POWs. And you mentioned that the Jews were the majority of victims of corpses in these mass graves, but the Soviet POWs come second. We don't know exactly, probably between 800,000 and 1 million POWs died on Soviet soil, and they are located in mass graves. And from time to time, it comes up, for example, during construction works, that a new mass grave is being found. So we still have to integrate this kind of research. So there are not much questions to be left. So I switched to the other paper by Michailo Martinenko on the Extraordinary State Commission here, with the example of the case studies on the Lviv Oblast. I think it is clear that the Extraordinary State Commission was highly politicized on the one side, but it is extremely important for us since it compiled this historical documentation. Unfortunately, the only monographical research on the Extraordinary State Commission itself in the West, you might know, which was compiled by the Danish historian Niels Bo Paulsen, is not publicly available. He published an article in Ukrainian, but not the whole book. And then in the West, we have lots of critical publications on the CGK. Of course, because it was highly politicized, and I wouldn't say it was independent. There were no independent institutions in Stalinism. It was, of course, a political tool. And as you mentioned, with a focus on economic exploitation, and it was a political tool for future negotiations on reparation. Stalin always was not very interested in how many people the Germans killed, but he was very interested in stopping the deportation of forced laborers to Germany, because that was workforce he needed after he reoccupied the territories. And of course, a big problem with the CGK is the falsification of documentation in the Katyn case. And I think Paulsen has found one or two other cases where this can be seen. But the CGK, on the other side, constitutes the only systematic collection of evidence on the Holocaust. And it's so systematic according to Oblasti, Rayoni, and so on. And in this original material, the Jews are mentioned as a distinctive group, like Michailo has also said, only if it's going up on the regional level, on the republic level, and on the union level, the Jews are left out and mixed as peaceful Soviet citizens. The CGK material often contains very important additional material, like lists of victims. We have big problems reconstructing the names of the victims, especially in Poland and in the former Soviet Union. And it sometimes contains original material from the wartime. For example, diaries. There's an important diary from Taganrog, for example, in the CGK material, sometimes even German documents. And if we turn away from the Holocaust, the CGK probably gives the only information on other victim groups than Jews. In, again, Soviet POWs, there was no systematic interview project on them. There is a collection of their letters in the Kontakti organization in Berlin, and in Memorial has something, but we're heavily relying on the CGK reports. The big problems with the CGK, which Michailo mentioned, are of course the politicization, and it was party functionaries who decided sometimes on the number of victims, like we heard on Stalag 3/2028, where they rose the number, but it's also the unclear statistics in general. I have the impression that the CGK during exhumation never counted the corpses unless in smaller mass graves, but it gave an estimate, and that's one of the reasons why the figures are so high. And all these cumulated figures end up in the national republic figures, and the Academy of Sciences in Kiev still uses these figures, which are much too high. So we don't have a proper statistic for the war victims of the Ukraine, at least that's my impression. It's a pity that the third presentation was not possible, since this is another important pool, and lots of the presenters mentioned it, the NKVD, NKGB investigations on war crimes, which is another treasure of witness statement, but highly problematic from a methodological point of view. And I also want to address what was found during the last years, this interview projects by the Soviet Academy of Sciences right after liberation. And there is a project in the United States working with this material, which was very difficult to access. And I hope that this will add to our knowledge on the local level. But if we take this early post-war period into consideration, we also have to address, of course, other important social problems, the return of the Jews to their homes, and how many problems that created. The flats were occupied by a non-Jewish population, and there was even virulent anti-Semitism. You might know the case of the two killed MGB officers in Kiev. This is only one of the kids. So I think it's necessary both to look for new methodologies on the one side and to investigate the early post-war period before Stalin more or less stopped all remembrance on the war for a while, and especially remembrance on the victims of the war. Thank you.
Дуже дякуємо, професор Дітер Поль, за ґрунтовні коментарі до обох доповідей.
Thank you very much, Professor Dieter Paul, for your well-grounded comments on all of the presentations. It is unfortunate that we lack the next presentation, but if the Editor's Office of Ukraine gives it to us, we will be able to read them. But in your comment, this analysis of the political background of the archaeology and other methods, but on the one hand, and on the other hand, the research in Lviv in 1944, these are controversial and very important topics for further research. I would like to remind us that we don't have a break right now because we only have one presentation in the fourth section, and essentially we're using the break time. But I wouldn't want to take too much time of our colleagues, so I would like to give the floor. I would like to ask our presenters to respond to the remarks of the discussant, maybe laconically, if they could. Mikhailo, if possible. Well, I only wanted to thank Professor Paul for his recommendations and appraisal in this introduction, this contextualization. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Mikhailo, and also Pani Daria, laconically, if you can. Well, thank you very much for your comments, Professor Paul. I am very pleased that many of your thoughts were already reflected in my research, because unfortunately, as of right now, I only had 15 minutes, so I tried to only focus on the Ukrainian context, study the context in the situation in Ukraine. But of course, we also have the research mission, the French mission in Dachau, and the research in Chełmno and in other camps. There's a very interesting and important project in the memorial sites in Poland that is that is the work of Roma Syndyka and many others. I never mind the huge pan-European project accessing camp space, and that was implemented over the past 5 years in which the Center for Archaeology was involved. I think that the subject of methods that were used by the ЧГК is one of the most important. And so which is why it's there's a whole chapter in my future dissertation that will be dedicated to this, to the analysis of the ideological component, not the ideological component, but analysis of the methods and the conclusions, why this, who was involved. So I'm very pleased, I'm very happy, very pleased with your comments, and I hope that there will be much more presented in the publication and in my further research. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daria. If you have anything to add, you can write in the chat. And I see that Karel Berkov has wanted to add something to Dieter Paul's. I should probably give the floor to Professor Karel Berkov on this, if you have something to say.
Well, there is a younger scholar not here, Paula Chan, American, and I happen to know a bit of her work on the ČGK, and this is extremely sophisticated. I think we should all be looking forward to what will come out of that, but it's very methodical approach, not just randomly finding the nicest bits, but really selecting certain regions and comparing them. I'm absolutely convinced that Michaela will make a wonderful contribution, but combining that with her work would enable us to really understand a whole lot more about what these people did. And I recall her telling me once that it sounds a little weird in Ukraine today, but when she looks at the records and notices that the NKVD is actually investigating a site, it's actually a reason to become a bit more optimistic that the figures will be correct. So, you know, it sounds a little provocative in Ukraine today, but it may be true. So let's wait for that. But in the meantime, I wish Michaela all the best with this very important research. And the same goes, of course, for Daria.
Приєднуємось до цих побажань і пані Дарії.
Yes, we join these wishes. And in conclusion of this, to conclude this session, would Professor Dieter Paul like to add anything in response, or perhaps in response to any of the remarks?
I know that's very nice what you said to me. No, but I think it's this contextualization that's so connecting to other fields of historiography is very important, and to see all, let's say, for example, if you work on the ČGK or the other institutions like Karel just mentioned, the NKVD, and of course this is one network of investigations which is responsible for all of this, and we need to see all the files, because the big problem with the post-Soviet memory is that there is a big gap in interviewing in oral history. In all the other countries, there were interviews during the 1950s and 60s, but almost none in the Soviet Union. This restarts only with the immigration wave to Israel, and Yad Vashem interviewed these immigrants from Ukraine, from other Soviet republics right away. But this is a big gap in historiography on the Holocaust on former Soviet soil. And that's why this is so important to look for every piece which has been compiled between 43 and in 47, 48. Thank you.
Дякуємо вам. Власне,
Thank you. Now, in order to manage this gap that you said right here and now, we practice these cross research, and this is basically the topic of our longer, larger 2-year project on the burden of memory and the Holocaust. And we will, on the one hand, we're starting a new session, and then we'll be talking about the prospects of the development of our cooperation, of our common investigation. And we have, by the way, Ms. Irina Lutashin has thoughts on this, who will be speaking in the end. It is only now it's up to me to only thank everybody for this important session.